Before we begin, a couple of quick notes. The Osireion at Abydos is a fascinating monument, and it attracts a lot of attention and speculation. One thing the public may not be aware of is that the Osireion's excavation and its internal features are extensively documented in photography. All of the major excavations in the early 1900s were undertaken with the funding of the Egypt Exploration Society, and the EES has made their photographic archives available for free online. Follow the links in the episode description to see these photo records, including the clearance and study of the Osireion by 3 major excavations. If you are interested in the digs themselves and the archaeological material, there are also publications available online for free. This includes the 2 major books by Margaret Murray and Henri Frankfurt, along with a couple of others made more recently by independent researchers. I have included links to all of these publications, where you can read and download them for free. In short, if you are interested in the Osireion and any aspect of its scientific history, I highly recommend checking those out. Additionally, despite my best efforts, this episode will not cover every single aspect of the Osireion. The monument is quite hard to describe in an audio format. The monument's architecture and decoration are both unfinished, making it hard to describe them fully. And the overall structure is radically different from how it was supposed to appear in antiquity. So the Osireion especially would benefit from a more visual presentation. With that in mind, I have started putting notes together to make a lecture on YouTube in which I can explore all of those visual elements in greater detail and clarity. I'm not sure when that will be ready, probably end of 2023 after my honeymoon, but when it is ready, I'll make a public announcement and include all the relevant links. If there is a topic or a subject that I don't cover, I will attempt to address that in the YouTube lecture. So if there is anything particularly detailed or small scale that you would like me to include, let me know by comments or email. You can leave comments on this episode on Spotify, Patreon, and the website, EgyptianHistoryPodcast.com, and you can reach me by email at egyptpodcast@gmail.com. Just put Osireion in the subject line, and I'll make a note of it to address it in the YouTube lecture. Hopefully, we can canvass a good variety of listener questions so that I can address all of your interests in that particular discussion. Finally, I should note that there is an extended PDF booklet for this episode available on my Patreon. For every new episode, I make a PDF booklet that includes high-quality photographs, line drawings and copies of the ancient artwork, maps and plans of different sites, and extensive notes regarding the texts and discussions of these ancient monuments. The booklet for the Osireion is particularly long, over 100 pages, so if you would like to read along, you can find that at patreon.com/Egypt podcast. Now then, thanks for waiting. On with the show. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 188, the Osireion. This is part 3 in our exploration of the great temple of Sety I at Abydos. We are not exploring the temple itself today, rather we are exploring a monument just behind Seti's temple. A curious structure that archaeologists call the Osireion can be found to the west of Seti's monument. It is an intriguing structure, and it has raised many questions among historians. Today, we explore it. We have now seen 2 sections of Seti's great temple. We have explored the 7 chapels devoted to different gods, and the Osiris complex, located at the very back of the sanctuary. We have also seen the Abydos king list, a curious record carved on the walls of the temple, in which Seti honors and gives offerings to a whole list of royal ancestors. Now, it is time to leave the corridor of lists, to say farewell to the kings of old and move on. But we are not going back into the temple. Instead, we take a door on our right, on the western side of the corridor. This leads to another corridor. A long passageway going west breaks off from the corridor of lists. The passage is decorated on both walls with elaborate scenes. The images are novel and interesting. But you may notice they have a different style from other parts of Seti's temple. Instead of emerging from the wall, these images are carved into it. This is a style called sunk relief, and it marks an area where Seti I, or his artists, did not finish their planned decoration. Instead, it fell to the son of Seti, Ramesses II, to commission the work in this passage. So we will talk about these scenes in the future. For now, we carry on up the hall, heading due west. At the end of the passage, there is a staircase. It leads up towards a door. The portal shines bright with the daytime sun. After your time in the hidden sanctuaries, it may seem blinding. But take a moment, let your eyes adjust, and then head out into the blazing day. You emerge from the doorway onto a sandy plain. You are now standing on the western side of Seti's great temple. This is a private area. The people are not supposed to access it. You have come into a space reserved for priests, the highest nobility, and the royal family. Away to the west, hidden by mounds of sand, there is a great wall and a pylon enclosing the western sections of Seti's temple. They are just ruins today, but they are there, and archaeologists have excavated them. But as you step out onto the desert plain, that wall and pylon are not the thing you'll notice first. Instead, directly ahead of you, you will see a great pit. To the west of Seti's temple, an enormous hole opens up. The pit is roughly square and dozens of meters wide, and along the edges and the bottom, you can see stone. The pit holds a monument, a relic of ancient piety and construction. This is the Osireion. The Osireion, its modern name, is an intriguing structure, and ever since its discovery in 1902, this monument has generated endless fascination, discussion, and speculation, and it's not hard to see why. If you visit the Osireion today, or see photographs of it, it looks like a strange monument, even unique. For one thing, the monument is underground. Unlike the Seti temple, which you have just left, the Osireion is constructed at the bottom of a great pit. This pit has been dug into the Abydos bedrock, and the stones were installed within it to form the structure you see today. So the very foundation of its architecture and design is completely different from what you see in the Seti monument. We will explore the significance of that a little bit later, but just as we orient ourselves, the Osireion does have a strange appearance. Another interesting feature is the masonry. One of the first things that spectators notice is how the central hall is dominated by enormous slabs of granite. The very center of the Osireion takes the form of a rectangular room, and along either side of the long edges, a series of granite pillars form the structure of the monument. These pillars are enormous, many tons each, and on top of them, another set of granite slabs form architraves. These connect the pillars together and provide stability for the roof. The roof is mostly gone today, although you can see traces of it at one edge of the monument. There, giant slabs of granite have broken away, but we can see where they originally stood and how the monument used to have a ceiling. These granite slabs, which form the pillars, architraves, and roof, are easily the most discussed and debated aspect of the Osireion. I will discuss these granite blocks in my YouTube lecture when I have the proper visual accompaniment. Suffice to say, when you first approach the Osireion on the surface of the desert, those slabs in the central hall are easily the dominating feature. Another interesting aspect is how the central hall is dominated by a stone island. The granite pillars and architraves are standing atop a podium. This podium is made of sandstone, or possibly quartzite, depending whom you're reading. Like the central hall that it dominates, this podium is rectangular, and it has an interesting feature. At either end of the podium, the north and south ends of the hall, a staircase has been cut into the stone. These staircases lead down from the top of the podium to a slightly lower level within the monument. And at the bottom of those staircases, you will find water. The stone island within the central hall is surrounded by an artificial canal. and at different times of the year, this canal fills with groundwater. Now, this water level can vary significantly based on the amount of groundwater present in the region. Modern irrigation has substantially saturated the Abydos area, but in antiquity, the water itself may have been slightly higher or lower depending on the movements of the Nile. Again, that's a topic that I'll get into in my YouTube lecture. But long story short, this central island with its little staircases is surrounded by an artificial canal, and that canal is full of groundwater. The canal itself is at least 7.8 meters deep. That is the lowest level that archaeologists in the 1920s were able to access using ground-penetrating rods. Unfortunately, the pressure from the water that deep down resisted any further attempts at exploration, and while teams working with more modern technology have attempted to drain the water and identify its source, these so far have been inconclusive. Again, this is a topic for the future YouTube lecture, but for now, it's enough to know that the canal surrounding the island in the central hall is remarkably deep, and we're still not sure the exact source of the water. Beyond the central hall, there are additional chambers. First, the central hall is surrounded by a series of small, square and rectangular rooms. These chambers, or cells, radiate around the central complex. There are 17 of them in total, and they seem to be largely unfinished. The stonework of these tiny chambers is not polished, not smoothed, and they completely lack any decoration. Their original purpose is still a bit unclear. They may have been designed for statues of a deity or the king, or perhaps the storage of ritual and sacred items. That is purely speculative, but it is a possible interpretation based on other Egyptian monuments. Beyond the tiny square rooms, there are two larger chambers. These are rectangular, and they run perpendicular to the central axis of the Osireion. We call these the transverse halls. There is one at the northern end and one at the southern. These chambers are interesting because they're some of the most completely decorated parts of the monument. Again, we'll come back to them later. Finally, we have the entrance passages, a series of corridors and small chambers which provide the original access to the Osireion. These halls and corridors are also decorated, and they are partly visible today, although they can be hard to access. These corridors and rooms provided the original entrance to the monument, the ones that the ancients intended. Those are the basic features of the Osireion, at least as far as you'll see them on a ground plan. But in order to understand the monument properly, we have to explore it on its own terms. In the modern age, tourists see the Osireion from two major perspectives. Most tourists see it from above, standing on the surface of the desert just behind the Temple of Sety. They look down into the Great Pit, viewing it either from the east or the south. And from this perspective, the dominating feature is the grand central hall. The other chambers are hard to see, if at all, and whatever you can see, you can't get a good handle on the details. Some tourists get a special permit to enter the monument, but even then, they approach it under different circumstances than the ancients were intending. The modern access to the Osireion is provided by a wooden staircase. This has been constructed on the southern edge of the Grand Central Hall, so even the tourists that have a special permit approach it from above, and they go immediately from the desert surface to the very heart of the monument. Suffice to say, both of these approaches, viewed from the outside or going down the staircase, are completely different to what the ancients intended. This has a massive impact on how we view and interpret the Osireion today. Our entire perspective is skewed by the modern appearance of the structure. So to understand the Osireion, we need to use our imagination. We need to approach the monument on its own terms, and we need to start from the beginning. Chapter 1. To explore the Osireion as it was originally intended, we need to use our imagination. First, that giant pit which the monument sits at the bottom of, we need to cover that up. Originally, the Osireion had a roof. It was covered by a layer of stone, followed by rubble, soil, and sand. The monument was buried underground. That is part of its original design, and it will help us to understand its purpose. So right out the gate, we need to cover that great pit with an imaginary layer of soil. The original surface of the Osireion is a matter of debate. There may have been a mound over the top of the monument, we're not certain. There may have been a tumulus made of soil and mud, or there may have been a flat garden. We know there was a grove or garden of some kind because archaeologists found pits which originally contained trees. These tree pits are a common feature of Egyptian temples, and there may have been something like this on the surface above the Osireion. Again, the exact layout or structure is uncertain. We know the trees were there because archaeologists have found the tree pits, but were they part of a flat garden or grove, or was there a mound over the top on which the trees were planted? On the current evidence, we can only speculate, and different scholars present different reconstructions of the surface. Leaving that to one side, we can say that above the Osireion, there was an artificial garden or grove of trees. So when somebody visited this precinct, it may have been quite a pleasant area. But let's say you were an ancient visitor. Somehow you had been granted permission to pass through the great temple of Sety and enter this precinct. You might appreciate the grove or garden and marvel at the beautiful trees. But beneath your feet, the Osireion was entirely hidden, buried beneath the soil. If you wanted to pay your respects or explore the monument, how would you do that? Where was the entrance? The entrance for the Osireion begins a little ways away from the Sety temple. To the northwest of the Great Pit, about 30 meters away, you'll find the remains of a wall. A mud brick structure on the desert surface used to surround the Osireion and the great temple of Sety I. We call this type of wall a temenos, a Greek word referring to the sacred precinct around a temple. The temenos of Abydos is mostly destroyed, but the foundations survive, and in 1902, when archaeologists were exploring this wall, they found the entrance to the Osireion. The Osireion's entryway is buried beneath the temenos wall. It is a doorway with an arched roof at the very base of that wall. Nothing grand, nothing fancy, just a dark hole beneath the sandy wastes. When you see the door in excavation photographs, it absolutely has that Tomb Raider vibe, a shadowy entrance with unknown treasures awaiting. The archaeologists who discovered the doorway cleared the sand away. It lay at the bottom of a shaft. A square hole, approximately 3 meters wide, opened into the earth. The shaft wasn't deep, just 4.7 meters from the surface to the floor, but it was deep enough to hinder easy access. Anyone trying to break into the Osireion would need ropes, multiple people, and time. So the Osireion has a basic security system at the outer entrance. Incidentally, the presence of this shaft provides our first clue to the overall purpose of the Osireion. In some sectors, you'll find the Osireion described as a temple, but this is not accurate, and it doesn't reflect the architecture or decoration of the monument. Case in point, the entrance shaft. Egyptian temples do not have entrance shafts. They are built on the surface of the desert, and they don't require this kind of access to reach them. Instead, entrance shafts are more often associated with tombs. Royal and non-royal sepulchres will often include a square shaft at the very start of the monument. This shaft was part of their security system. It would be filled with rubble as a way to deter robbers or anyone intruding the monument. The presence of this shaft at the very entrance of the Osireion provides our first clue to the structure's overall purpose. Based on the entrance, we are not coming into a temple complex. Rather, we are coming into a tomb. At the bottom of this shaft, there is the doorway. When archaeologists found it, the door was blocked. Stacks of bricks had sealed the entrance, placed by the ancients when they were closing the monument. On those bricks, The builders had stamped a name, Men Ma'at Ra, enclosed in a cartouche. That is the royal name of King Sety I, so this pharaoh's name appears on the monument's door, stamped on the bricks that sealed the passage. Behind the bricks, you find the proper entrance to the Osireion. This is a corridor, a long passage that descends into the earth. The passage is cut out of the Abydos bedrock. It goes down in a shallow slope, heading from the northwest to the southeast. The passage is long, 32 meters from start to finish. It has an arched ceiling made of bricks and limestone mortar. The walls of this passage are decorated. Today, very few parts of the Osireion have decoration, but the entry passage does. Along the walls, you will find hieroglyphs and images. These come from a book. 2 books, in fact. Books related to the underworld and the afterlife of Egyptian religion. On either wall of this corridor, to your right and your left, respectively, you will find scenes from the Book of Gates and the Book of Caverns. The Book of Gates is a recent invention. It first appeared around 1310 BCE in the royal tomb of King Horemheb. We explored the Book of Gates in full in episodes 175 and 176. Long story short, the Book of Gates describes and explains parts of the Egyptian underworld. The Book of Caverns is similar, another underworld text, but it has a slightly different structure and focus than the Book of Gates. We have not explored the Book of Caverns in this podcast yet, but we will another time. Suffice to say, the Book of Caverns complements the Book of Gates, providing an extended description of the afterlife and the world of the dead, the kingdom of Osiris. Moving along the corridor, past the 2 funerary books, the light diminishes. There are no windows in this corridor, no skylights, to allow any sunlight. The ancients would use torches or candles to brighten their passage. Again, it is like you are entering a tomb, carved into the bedrock beneath a cliff or pyramid. You can imagine how the darkness gives an underworld feeling. In the flickering candlelight, the hieroglyphs would seem to dance and move, and the figures of gods or denizens of the underworld could almost seem alive within the shadows of the passage. Walking along the corridor, lit by fire and flame, you would enter a world of darkness, but with shadowy hints of life. After 32 meters of passage, you suddenly enter a chamber. A small, rectangular room opens out before you. Today, this chamber is open to the sky, but originally it was roofed, so it would have been dark. There were no windows or skylights, so you would have to use your candles to see around. And again, you would find scenes of the underworld. The walls of this section are covered with scenes from the Book of the Dead, and there is also a large figure of Osiris, the king of the dead. He appears seated upon his throne, while his son Horus makes offerings to ensure his father's rule and the eternity of the Egyptian afterlife. This antechamber is nothing fancy, but its presence is noteworthy. The small rectangular hall at the end of the corridor is another feature that often appears in tombs. In the Valley of the Kings, for example, many royal monuments have an identical chamber at the end of their entrance passages. These chambers are usually quite simple, sparsely decorated, or sometimes not at all. They are most common in the 18th dynasty tombs. The monuments of kings like Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and Thutmose IV all have these antechambers. Why are they there? Well, in that period, the royal burials had a bent axis. They would start going in one direction, but then the corridors would turn 90 degrees or more to progress further into the earth. There was a reason for that turn, which I'll come back to later, but from a practical perspective, that sudden change presented an architectural problem. When the mourners were installing a sarcophagus, dragging it into the sepulchre, they could not easily turn the rectangular box in the narrow confines of a corridor. So, in the 18th dynasty, these antechambers provided an extra space for rotating the sarcophagus and taking it further into the tomb. Now, why exactly is that relevant? Well, just like the 18th dynasty tombs, the Osireion now makes a 90-degree turn. From the antechamber, a doorway on the left, or north, leads to the next phase of the monument. Now, you enter a sloping passage that descends deeper into the earth. You are approaching the heart of the structure. From the antechamber, you turn left or north. You pass through a door and head down a sloping passage. By now, any hint of sunlight from the entrance is well and truly gone. You are in a world of darkness, the underworld of Osiris. As you descend the passageway, your candle might pick out images on the walls, scenes from the Book of the Dead, including one image where a pharaoh plays a board game. He sits at a table on which a set of small figurines are laid out, as if the king is playing an ancient form of chess or drafts. The hieroglyphs flicker in the shadows, containing their arcane references to the underworld and the land of the dead. You carry on, deeper into the monument. At the bottom, you reach a hall. This is one of the transverse halls. It stretches away to your left and your right, that is, northwest and southeast. The transverse hall is a narrow rectangular corridor. It has a triangular roof, where the ancients have carved the stones back to form a peak in the ceiling. Again, the room is decorated with texts and images from the Book of the Dead. Amidst these funerary scenes, you are now approaching the very core of the Osireion. Daylight is a distant memory. It is a world of shadow, lit only by your candles. From the transverse hall, you pass another doorway. Now, you enter the central hall. Amid the darkness, the central hall is a world of shadows and square blocks. The enormous granite pillars stretch away into the distance. Their architraves loom overhead, and above them, the stone ceiling is still in place. Without your candle, this area would be pitch black, and if you tried to enter without light, you would very easily injure yourself. As you emerge from the doorway, you are standing on a ledge. This ledge goes around the perimeter of the room, giving access to the tiny chambers or cells which radiate out from the central hall. In the gloom, you can only see the doors of those hidden chambers. You may notice that the stonemasonry surrounding the tiny cells is still unfinished. The stone blocks are rough and not yet dressed, as if the builders have just downed their tools and left long before they completed their work. But one thing they did finish was the canal. The ledge on which you are standing juts out over the moat, which surrounds the central hall and separates those outer chambers and the entrance from the stone podium at its heart. The canal is deep, you cannot see the bottom, and in the darkness the waters themselves are black. If you fell, it would be very hard to escape. We'll assume for the moment that you have a plank of wood that you can place over that canal in order to access the central podium. You do so, and as you cross the divide, you might look down to see your candlelight flickering on the inky black surface. Be careful, watch your footing, lest you slip and plunge down into the waters at the heart of Osiris' kingdom. If you do, well,
you'll float too.
As you approach the podium, look down. You will notice that this island is not carved out of bedrock. Rather, it has been constructed from large blocks of stone. The stone may be sandstone or possibly quartzite. Either way, this is not a natural island. It is artificial. The slabs have been erected to form this podium. Reaching the central island, you are standing at the very heart of the Osireion. The granite blocks loom overhead. They are sparse, only decorated in a couple of areas. The original plan may have called for more extensive carving, or even plaster and paint on the surface. Alas, this was never completed, so we can only imagine what the ancients might have intended. So the hall has a deceptively austere appearance. Looking around, your candlelight bounces over smooth, polished stone. Stepping onto the central podium, you notice a staircase. It is cut into the very center of the southern end of the island, and it descends from the floor down to the water level. Like the outer walls, the staircase is unfinished. Some of the steps are rough, as if they have been hurriedly carved out of the rock. Apparently, when the builders were completing their work, they needed to finish the staircase quickly. It didn't need to be perfect, but it needed to be there. So looking at the stonework, you will notice the staircase is rough and unfinished. Just ahead of the staircase, at the very center of the podium, there is a curious depression. A rectangular hole cut into the floor sits at the very heart of the monument. The hole is shallow, more like a slot. It is rectangular and long, roughly large enough for a table, an altar, or even a sarcophagus. We don't know what was there originally, or at least what was intended to be there. I have a couple of suspicions that I'll come back to later, but as you explore the hall in the darkness, keep an eye out for that depression in the floor. You wouldn't want to slip. At the other end of the island, the northern end, there is another staircase. This one also descends from the floor level down to the water. This staircase is slightly more finished, as if they completed it first and were able to perfect the cutting a bit better. There is not too much to say about it, but it is noteworthy. These two parallel staircases at either end of the island are a distinctive feature of the Osireion. They do have parallels in ancient Egyptian art and iconography, and we will discuss those another time in a more visual format. But long story short, the central island at the heart of the Osireion has a staircase at either end, a shallow depression in the center, and it is lined with huge square pillars. Taking a moment to look around, you could be forgiven for imagining a sort of cathedral atmosphere. The hall, with its square columns and high ceiling, may remind one of a church or temple. Again, this is not quite the case. The hall in which you are standing is remarkably similar to those of royal burial chambers. Rectangular rooms with square pillars and staircases descending downward are a common feature in the 18th dynasty royal tombs. You will find remarkably similar architecture in the sepulchres of Amunhotep II, Thutmose IV, Amunhotep III, and Horemheb, and you will find modified versions in the burial chambers of Seti I, Ramesses II, and many of their later successors. Basically, the rectangular chamber with square pillars, a staircase leading down, and a slot carved into the floor is a common feature of royal tombs. Once again, we see that the architecture of the Osireion is not that of a temple, it is that of a funerary monument. If you face straight ahead along the same axis in which you entered the monument, you will see a wall to the north. The wall is an impressive facade carved from large sandstone blocks. It towers overhead, and the upper levels are interesting. To either side, huge granite blocks jut out in front of the wall. These originally supported the roof, but the granite blocks do not cover the entire expanse of the hall. Instead, they jut out slightly, providing a ledge for the roofing slabs above. As a result, the northern wall is framed at the top by blocks jutting out from the architraves. That gives the top of the wall a distinctly curved or arched appearance. This is interesting because it's a design that we start to see during the 19th dynasty in royal burial chambers. Changing their practice from the earlier 18th dynasty, kings like Seti I, Ramesses II, and their descendants designed their burial chambers with curved or arched ceilings. We see a remarkably similar design in the Osireion. The wall itself is decorated with carvings, scenes of kings and deities making offerings and receiving blessings. It has hieroglyphic texts which bear the name of its decorator. And at the very bottom of this wall, in the center, there is a door. Taking your plank of wood, you place it over the canal that separates the northern edge of the island from that wall and door. You cross over, pass through the low entrance, and come into the final section of the Osireion. First, you enter a tiny room. This is one of those chambers or cells that ring the central hall, and which are largely unfinished. At the northern end of this room, there is a hole, a space broken through the stone to provide access to the next area. It's not clear if this was always intended to be the entrance, or if it is simply unfinished, and if the hole was supposed to be blocked up. Either way, it is open for now, so duck through and enter the final chamber. Ducking through, you enter another rectangular room. Like the transverse hall earlier in the monument, this one stretches from the northwest to the southeast, your left to your right. Again, it has a triangular roof, where the ancients have carved the stone blocks back to form a peak in the ceiling. There's not much in this chamber, just a stone floor and occasionally some groundwater. But what makes it distinctive is the decoration. This room is the most completely decorated section of the Osireion. It is covered with texts and images related to funerary and even astronomical subjects. On the ceilings, you find the large form of a woman. Her body stretches out, with her feet at one end, her hands at the other, and her torso arching over the ceiling. These are figures of Nut, the sky goddess, who might be associated with the Milky Way. Nut dominates the scene, but she is noticeably supported by her brother, Shu, who stands beneath her and raises his arms to lift the goddess up. At her feet, we see a sun disk, and another one at her mouth. The imagery of Nut with the sun conveys the idea of the goddess swallowing the sun disk every night as it sets below the horizon. That sun passes through her body, before it is reborn in her womb and then emerges from her toes at the eastern horizon of dawn. So the ceiling is conveying an image of the nighttime sky, and that is emphasized by the hieroglyphs. Across the body of Nut, and in columns beneath her, we find the names of various constellations, and we also have something like an astronomical calendar. Columns of hieroglyphs seem to record the movements of certain stars in a regular notation period. The exact system is still a matter of debate among scholars, but the most common explanation is that these are decans, 10-day periods in which the stars are observed in their movements through the sky. The ancient Egyptians were skilled astronomers. From the very earliest days of their history and prehistory, they used the movements of stars to track the coming of the seasons, the shifting of celestial bodies, and of course, the movements and actions of the gods. We will explore Egyptian astronomy in a future episode. It is a massive subject, and it deserves detailed exploration and discussion. I will also explore these images of Nut and the astronomical calendar in my YouTube lecture, when we can approach it from a visual perspective and get to grips with the images and details. For now, it is enough to know that the ceiling of this room includes a large-scale depiction of Nut, held up by her brother Shu, and it also includes the movement of certain stars, tracked throughout the year to record the heavenly patterns. I realize some people will be especially fascinated by this image. You can find a full description of the texts and copies of the scene in the 2-volume publication by Henri Frankfurt from 1933 about the Osireion. Those books are available online for free, and I have placed a link in the episode description. So Nut dominates the ceiling. What about the rest of the room? At the northern end of this hall, you will find an elaborate series of tableaux. These images are beautiful and related to the underworld. At the top, we see a sun disk with long wings stretching out over the scenes below. Beneath the sun disk are 2 cobras, uraei, who protect the god and spit fire at his enemies. Hanging from the uraei are a series of symbols, ankh and jed pillars alternating one after the other. The ankhs, meaning life, and the jeds, meaning stability or endurance, cascade down as if they are raining from the sun disk itself. At the bottom of this stream, we find something like a river, on which 2 boats are sailing. These boats are the solar barks, the water ships of Ra that he uses to cross the daytime and nighttime skies. Ra appears on the boats in 2 forms. One, a male with the head of a falcon and a sun disk for his crown. The other is an entirely human male with a long beard and wearing the double crown of southern and northern Egypt. These forms, the falcon and the human, are the gods Ra Horakti and Ra Atum, representing the earthly and cosmic manifestations of the god, respectively. The male deities reach out a hand to greet another figure. This is the king, Sety I, who appears on each of the solar barks as he enters the sky and joins with Ra. The image of the king entering the heavens and uniting with the sun god is a classic motif. It appears in all the royal funerary texts, and it is an important component of the Egyptian kingship as a concept. The idea of the pharaoh as a link between humanity and the gods. We see it here in the figure of Sety I, who steps onto the bark of Ra and joins the sun god in the sky. Those are the upper images. At the bottom, we find Sety as a mummy. The king lies within a shrine, protected and blessed by a god. The mummy of Sety is lying on its stomach, as if he is preparing to rise and awaken to new life. Interestingly, the mummy itself is lying upon a bed in the form of a lion. This type of funerary bed is a common motif, and we actually have physical examples from the tomb of King Tutankhamun. So the same idea is playing out here in the monument of Sety I. Beneath the lion bed, there is an array of weapons, shields, scepters, and crowns. The full panoply of an Egyptian king as a ruler, a governor, and a warrior. Whatever Sety might need in the next world to display and enforce his authority, those symbols and tools are placed beneath his bed. So the king, preparing to awake, is ready for anything. Around the outside of this image, we find dozens of minor deities. They appear in various forms: lionesses, jackals, crocodiles, humans, baboons, and ibis. These deities come forth to greet the king as he enters the heavenly realms, and also to protect Sety and Ra as they make their journey through the day and the night. It is a classic underworld scene. The king enters the next life, the gods come forth to bless him, and the pharaoh himself is ready to take his place in eternity. There are other texts and images around this chamber that continue the themes of the underworld and astronomy. These are interesting, but they are visually complicated, so I'll come back to them in the future. Long story short, we have one image where Sety is greeted by the goddess Nut, who stretches her arms out to embrace him as he enters the sky for his eternal rest. In another scene, we have something called a shadow clock. This is a type of ancient sundial where astronomers would use tall, straight rods to measure the movement of shadows and to mark the passing of the hours. A shadow clock appears on the walls of Sety's tomb, along with instructions on how to use it and measure the passing of the day. It is a fascinating text, but again, it benefits from a visual presentation, so keep it in mind, and we will come back to that in the future. The ceiling of Nut, the wall of the underworld, an astronomical calendar, and a shadow clock. These are some of the decorations which adorn this last chamber. It's an interesting set of images, and most notably, it is the only room in the Osireion entirely decorated within the reign of Sety I. Most of the decoration that I have described this far was commissioned by one of Sety's successors, a king named Merneptah. You will find the name of Merneptah throughout the Osireion, except for this last chamber. There is some suspicion that Sety planned most of the decoration that we see today, but his artists never did it, or at least they never reached the carving stage. In this chamber, though, at the northern end of the monument, there is a complete set of images and hieroglyphs carved by Sety's artisans. That tells us a couple of things. First of all, this chamber at the northern end must have been decorated first, and as such, it may be the most important chamber in the Osireion itself. That is an informed speculation, but logically, you would start with the most important section, right? Get that part done, then you can move to the secondary rooms. If that is accurate, then what is so special about this room? Why was it the most fully decorated part of Sety's building project? The answer depends partly on how you interpret the Osireion, and we're going to explore that a little bit later. But just by looking at the decorations, we can get a hint at what this room is doing. The imagery of Nut and the stars give a sense that there is a focus on the sky and the celestial bodies. So in one sense, it is dealing with the realm of the gods and the movements of the great beings that shape the natural world. In another sense, it is focused on the afterlife, the kingdom of Osiris, that also takes place within the sky, but primarily during the night. The images of Nut convey the physical setting of the sky, but the other images convey a greater focus on the underworld. So we are dealing with a funerary chamber, focused on the afterlife and depicting the world of the dead. That is hammered home by the hieroglyphs. On the walls of this chamber, you will find texts describing the passage of the gods into the realm of Osiris, and particularly the journey of King Seti. The hieroglyphs say, quote, "The setting in life, or sunset, of the majesty of this god, Ra, the making of splendor and of sunlight in the darkness, the opening of the gate of the sky in the west, approaching the first gateway, which is named the mistress of the sky and earth, and the second hour of the night, which is named Shesa, she who protects her lord. Words said by the king Seti, O shining bull, great god who makes this god enter the horizon. I am the one who makes Ra enter with you. I, Seti, steer the solar bark to see the beautiful west. O Sia, goddess of perception, bring my words to Atum, the creator, when he enters the underworld. Ensure that the divine council of the west and the souls know what I, Seti, have done for them." End quote. So one of the texts communicates the idea of King Seti entering the afterlife, along with other deities like Ra. These are the sort of texts that we find on the walls of burial chambers and even royal sarcophagi. They are the tools to help a king leave the earthly realm and enter the Duat, the land of the dead. With texts like these, Seti can ascend to the immortal realm. He can step onto the bark of Ra and join the sun god in his eternal journey over the heavens. With that in mind, the funerary focus of this chamber becomes clear. It is the very heart of the tomb, the heart of the Osireion as a sacred space. I'll come back to this in a moment when we discuss the larger significance and function of the monument. But long story short, looking at the images and texts within this room, the only room fully decorated by Seti I, we can get a sense of what he was trying to achieve. It is a funerary monument designed to facilitate the immortality of the king, of Osiris, and of the gods. If there is any doubt about that, another passage makes the point clear. Seti I issues instructions to the gods that they come together, receive his offerings, and guarantee his immortality. Quote, "A command to the gods, take your heads, join your bones, and receive your offerings, from the shining bull, King Seti, given life and living with the imperishable stars." End quote. That last phrase, the imperishable stars, is a reference to the northern circumpolar stars. Those are the stars which, in the northern hemisphere, circle around the North Pole, and to an observer on the ground, they appear to remain eternally above the horizon. These imperishable stars never dip below the Earth's surface, so they never vanish, they never die. And if Seti joins them on the solar bark of Ra, he will live forever. We have now visited the major chambers of the Osireion: the entrance passages, antechambers, transverse hall, central hall, and the final funerary chamber. It is time to return to the surface and take a look back on what we have learned. We must analyze the Osireion as a whole to see what the architecture and the decoration are telling us. What is the purpose of this monument? Why is it here? And of course, we will engage with the discovery and excavation of the monument, and address a nagging question that many people have. How old is the Osireion? Was it constructed by Seti I? Or did he find it? That is after the break. See you in a moment. Chapter 2. We have now explored the Osireion in detail. We have followed the underground passages and attempted to imagine the monument as it used to appear. Today, the Osireion sits at the bottom of a great pit, open to the sky, and accessed by modern tourist conveniences. All of this has fundamentally changed the appearance of the monument and completely warps our perception of it, especially compared to what the ancients intended. But what did the ancients intend? What is the purpose of the Osireion? Why is it here behind the temple of Sety I? That is a complicated question. To answer it, we have to understand the archaeological history of the monument. We have to discuss its discovery and the excavations. Only by doing that can we get a fuller sense of how the monument was found, how its modern appearance has changed, and see what the objects and artifacts tell us about the monument's purpose. Doing that, we can come to a greater understanding of the Osireion overall, and we can discuss a question that has intrigued many visitors and observers. How old is the Osireion? Is it a project of the 19th dynasty? Or did Sety find it? Let's explore. The Osireion was first discovered in the winter of 1901 to 1902, and like most major finds, the discovery was entirely unexpected and accidental. At the end of 1901, a large-scale excavation project was underway in Abydos. It was led by a man named Algernon St. George Thomas Caulfield, which is either a fabulous name or a ridiculous one. The other leader was William Flinders Petrie, probably the most skilled and influential archaeologist of his day. A formidable team, Caulfield and Petrie were hard at work documenting the Temple of Sety I at Abydos. They were not the first excavators to work in the region of Abydos. Auguste Mariette had also examined the temple in the 1860s and led enormous teams to clear sand and debris from various parts of the region. But Mariette had been mainly interested in art and hieroglyphs. Petrie and Caulfield were true excavators. In the course of their work, Petrie and Caulfield had studied and measured the Sety temple, and they had worked around the precinct, the general area. They located one of the temple's western features, a pylon gate and causeway that led into the desert. Those were important finds, but hard-won. At the time, the back area of Sety I's temple was covered in huge mounds, where Mariette's excavators had dumped their sand and rubble during earlier work. So the western part of Sety's temple complex was a complete mess. Petrie and Caulfield had a huge task sorting through it. Eventually, the excavation team, that is, the Egyptian workers, had cleared enough that proper digging could begin. By late 1901, the team was exploring the Temenos Wall. This is the mud brick wall enclosing Sety's temple. Most Egyptian sanctuaries had a temenos that surrounded the area and kept it secluded, separate from the outside world. Petrie was interested to find that wall so that they could properly survey, measure, and assess the entire monument. Then, things took an interesting turn. As the team dug along the northwestern section of the temenos, Petrie noticed an area of low-lying soil. The depression was narrow, and it ran in a straight line. That seemed to indicate a structure, and the team got to work clearing it. Basket after basket, they removed the soil and sand. They found small items like pieces of Roman rubbish, and also a lot of clean sand. That is, sand that had blown in, settled, and laid undisturbed. Clean sand is always exciting, for it suggests an untouched spot, where you may find objects or structures in their original condition. Petrie's team dug through the sand until they hit stone, limestone. An artificial pavement, rather than the natural bedrock, lay at the bottom of a pit. Clearing further, they seemed to have found a chamber. A small room dug into the rock was located near the western edge of Sety's temple wall. The room was in poor condition. The limestone had already been damaged and removed, possibly during Roman times or later, and only a few pieces remained of the floor. Still, the team had something. What exactly? Unclear. But something. Alas, the excavation reached this limestone pavement at the end of their dig season. The money was running out, the heat was increasing, and the workers needed to go home. It was time to wrap things up until next year. There is a classic Murphy's Law in archaeology that even if you spend 6 months feverishly digging in an area, on the very last day you will find something significant, begging you to go further. But time and money force you to pause, to cover it up and return next season. That was the case with Caulfield and Petrie. 10 months later, work could resume. The next winter, at the end of 1902, a new excavation began. This time, Caulfield was gone, working on the publication of his earlier work. Now, the job of excavation and clearance fell to Petrie. Or rather, it fell to Petrie's colleagues. To explore the ruins that were so far identified, Petrie delegated the task to his wife, Hilda, and their colleague, Ms. Margaret Murray. Margaret Murray is an interesting figure. She was born in Kolkata, or Calcutta as it was known, during the 1860s, the height of the British Raj. She was born to an English family and later moved to Britain. There, she enrolled to study at the University College London, UCL, specialising in the young field of Egyptology. Soon, Murray became a trusted student and then colleague of Petrie. Margaret Murray was knowledgeable, skilled, and experienced. So, Petrie delegated the task of excavating this monument, whatever it was, to Murray's oversight. Murray and Hilda Petrie began organising the work. In Murray's own description, published later, she described the work as follows, quote, "The excavations this year, 1902 to 1903, were carried on by Mrs. Petrie and myself. Mrs. Petrie managed the actual excavations, overseeing the men, paying the wages, in short, all the dull and uninteresting, though very necessary, part of the work. Whereas I had the more congenial and amusing employment of copying the sculptures, or inscriptions. Until the sculptures were sufficiently cleared for me to draw them, I spent my time in the Sety Temple. Then, when it was possible to draw in the hypogeum, the excavated chamber, I set to work." End quote. You can see Murray's priorities. While Hilda Petrie managed the excavation, including all of the administrative and oversight duty, Murray waited for inscriptions. Like many Egyptologists, past and present, her first interest was the writing and imagery that adorned the walls, doors, and chambers of the monument. That is not a criticism, it is just the way things were. From her own account, Murray worked in the main temple, while out back, Hilda Petrie and the Egyptian workers set to digging, and digging, and digging. Eventually, the monument was sufficiently cleared for Murray to begin her work. At this point, the excavators had cleared a corridor and a series of small rooms. They had not found the main part of the Osireion. That would come later. But in early 1903, the first chambers were open and visible, and Murray could document the finds. The excavation had uncovered the entrance passageway, that long corridor running from northwest to southeast. The passage started just outside the temenos, the mud brick wall that surrounds Seti's temple, and it descended into the earth, cut directly into the bedrock. The passage was roofed with slabs of stone, but only a few of those remained. The rest had been broken, hauled out, and removed long ago. As a result, the excavators found the passage exposed to the sky. That was a challenge. As they dug, the desert sand tended to pour down into the corridor they were clearing. Murray describes the problem, quote, "The whole of the excavation was greatly slowed by heavy falls of sand, the Roman filling above the passage being so loose that there were continual rivulets of sand running down the sides, and a high wind would bring down 1/2 ton of sand and stones in one fall. To sit in a deep pit under an irregular but continuous fire of small stones with the chance of a big stone coming down too, is an experience more amusing to look back on than it is to endure." End quote. So the work was slow and surprisingly dangerous. Sand and rubble continually trickled, even poured, into the passage and chambers. The task of clearing this monument was almost unending. Over several weeks, though, they stabilized the ground and the sand, and soon Murray could study the exposed chambers. She could analyze their features and document them. Murray copied the decoration and arranged for translations of the hieroglyph texts, and she recorded everything that she found. The result was a publication 1 year later titled The Osireion at Abydos. The book came out in 1904, and it is available for free online. Links in the episode description. In this book, Margaret Murray lays out everything she knew about the Osireion during the first phase of its discovery. She includes line drawings for the artistic scenes and hand copies of the hieroglyphs and graffiti added by ancient tourists. Her description focuses on the corridor leading from the entrance and the antechambers at the end of that passage. In her book, she calls these the South Chamber and the Great Hall. That second term, Great Hall, can be confusing. It sounds like it should refer to the massive Central Hall, the stone space that you primarily see today. But Murray and her team did not know that that hall was there. All they had excavated were the entry rooms and passages. So her Great Hall, quote-unquote, is actually a tiny room, relatively speaking, just part of the entrance to the larger context. I mention this because when I first started to research the Osireion in depth, I found Murray's description confusing. Why was this small chamber called the Great Hall when the much greater hall was right there? Working through the excavation report, it soon became clear, but that was a frustrating few minutes. Murray's interpretation of the monument was hampered by the fact that her team had only cleared part of it. To her credit, she recognized that in her work, but looking at the visible sections, Murray thought the Osireion was maybe a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb. She attributed it, potentially, to the pharaoh Merneptah. That is based on the decorations in those early chambers, which predominantly bear the cartouches of Merneptah. The second possibility that Murray considered was a tomb for Osiris, related to the religion and mysteries of that god, and facilitating his resurrection. This view was based on the decoration, the texts and images from the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, the Book of the Dead, and other imagery that you might find in a royal tomb. All of that connected to the world of the dead and the mythology of Osiris generally. And what's more, some of the decorative scenes explicitly showed Osiris as the dominant figure. So overall, Murray concluded that the Tomb of Osiris angle was the most likely interpretation. But since the work was just preliminary, there was no certainty. I'll come back to this later in the episode when we discuss the purpose of the Osireion overall. For now, that was the essence of Murray's interpretation. Margaret Murray's season came to an end in early 1903. The next year, she began work at Saqqara in the north, studying the mastaba tombs of the Old Kingdom. That work was important, and it remains useful for scholars today. Alas, these excavations took Murray away from Abydos, at a time when work in the Osireion was only just beginning. The monument was partially cleared and studied, but there was more, so much more, to reveal. Margaret Murray and Hilda Petrie had overseen the first major excavation of the Osireion complex. Their team had dug down a fair way, uncovering the entrance passages and antechambers. But surprisingly, it would take 10 years and another project to reveal the full majesty of this monument. Our story now jumps to the winter of 1912. In that season, a man named Henri-Edouard Naville came to Abydos. Naville was Swiss, born in Geneva in the 1840s. He worked in Egypt during the 1860s at places like Edfu, the Temple of Horus. Later, he served in the Swiss army during the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. Then, in the 1880s, Naville returned to excavation, working at a whole series of important sites like Bubastis, Heracleopolis, and Tel el Yahudiyeh, or the Hill of the Jews. Like many of his contemporaries, Naville took a great interest in biblical history, especially the Old Testament, as it related to Egypt, the Exodus, and the early Israelites. Also, like his contemporaries, Naville was an old-school archaeologist. He was not meticulous, he was not detailed. He wasn't bad, but compared to scholars like Petrie, Edouard Naville was more superficial in his work and far less concerned with the details. That would be a problem. From 1912 to 1914, Naville oversaw a massive excavation in the Osireion. His working team was huge, around 500 men and boys, quote-unquote. These locals cleared sand, removed rubble, and dug into the loose soil that covered the Osireion site. Naville's excavations were funded by the Egypt Exploration Society, or EES, and they were extensively photographed. You can see these photos online, links in the episode description. As you will find, the task was enormous. Unfortunately, Naville's description of the excavation is vague. He never wrote a full book or publication about the Osireion. Despite the scale of his work, Naville limited his comments to a few articles in academic journals. And as you will see, his style of writing or analysis skips a lot of the detail. As a result, it can be hard to pinpoint what his team was doing on what date. I've done my best with the resources available, but the record is spotty. Over 2 seasons, Naville's team dug beyond the entrance passages. Murray and her team had revealed the antechambers. Now, Naville's team did the rest. The workers cleared sand from the doorways in the early chambers. This revealed the sloping passage that goes down deeper into the earth. Again, it was cut into the bedrock, but the ceiling was made of sandstone with great slabs covering the gap. This corridor led to the transverse chamber, that one with the triangular roof, that goes from left to right across the passage. So far, nothing too remarkable. But then, the excavations started to reveal monoliths. As Naville described it, quote, "In front was a doorway with a huge monolithic lintel, 15 feet long. We very much hoped that would lead us to another passage, which would bring us to the Temple of Sety I. But we soon perceived that behind the lintel were 2 others of the same length and thickness, and that the whole was merely a door in stone, a wall about 12 feet thick, built of enormous blocks of sandstone and red quartzite." End quote. Naville's team had reached the central hall, the enormous room which is, today, the most visible area. At the time, the central hall was full to the ceiling of rubble, sand, and detritus. In antiquity, the roof of the Osireion, the ceiling slabs, had been taken away by later generations. As a result, the monument had slowly collapsed as sand and rubble filled in the space. Naville's team got to work. Their digging revealed the enormous blocks of granite used for the pillars and architraves, of sandstone used for the floors, and limestone for the outer walls and reinforcements of the structure. Again, Naville's description is frustratingly vague. He mentions the extent of the work, the number of people involved, and some of the mechanisms they had to use. But when it comes to the archaeological details, like the consistency of the soil and sand that they were clearing, the small objects that they may have found within, he is largely silent. This is what I mean when I say that Naville was not detail-oriented. Most of his comments are focused on the large-scale aspects of the project, the clearing and physical labor, and the architecture of the building overall. He is not particularly focused on these smaller, nitty-gritty aspects. Fortunately, we do have many photos in the archives of the Egypt Exploration Society. These photos provide an extensive record of the work, and they document many aspects of the temple on which Navil barely commented. Again, these are part of the EES photo archive, which is available online. Links in the episode description. Anyway, Navil's analysis may have been brief, but he did offer some comments on his interpretation of the monument. First, regarding the purpose, Navil agreed with Murray in the sense that the Osireion was likely a tomb of some kind related to Osiris. He did not come to a firm conclusion over the nature of that tomb, whether it was a ceremonial space that priests might use in rituals, or whether it was a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb for burial of the god. Navil was interested in the religion of Osiris, of other deities associated with the god, and the landscape of Abydos overall, and now that he had cleared the entire monument, revealing its full architectural scope and decoration, Navil agreed that the Osireion had a decidedly funerary character. Navil had another interpretation though. This one was related to the date. In the course of his discussion, Navil briefly compared the Osireion to a mastaba. This was quite revealing. Mastaba tombs, a word meaning bench in Arabic, are low, flat structures associated with the Old Kingdom period. And indeed, Navil ultimately believed that the Osireion had started as a monument of that period, or even earlier. Specifically, Navil thought the Osireion was a product of the 4th dynasty, the age of the great pyramid builders like Khufu and Khafra. He based this on the architecture. Looking at the construction of the central hall, particularly those granite pillars and architraves, Navil compared the work to the monuments at Giza, particularly the Valley Temple of King Khafra and the nearby Temple of the Sphinx. In one of his articles, published in 1914, Navil wrote the following on this point. Quote, "In spite of the ruined state of the great pool, what he called the central hall, it is impossible not to be struck by its majestic simplicity. It has all the characteristics of a very old construction. There is hardly one person who, after having seen it, did not say at once that it was very similar to the Temple of the Sphinx. It is of exactly the same style of architecture and masonry, and the same absence of ornament or decoration of any kind. But its proportions are larger than those of the Temple of the Sphinx. In the latter, the granite pillars are only 3 feet square. At Abydos, they are 8.5. The architraves are in proportion to the pillars, and the whole construction is verily what is called cyclopean. I have no hesitation in putting the date of its erection, the construction of the monument, to the time of the Old Empire, the 4th dynasty, when the Temple of the Sphinx was built, and perhaps even earlier. It is not impossible that this is the oldest Egyptian building of large proportions which has been preserved." End quote. That is pretty much the extent of Navil's comments on the date of the monument. You may notice that, like his other discussions, it is surprisingly lacking in detail. Navil discusses the overall impression of the monument, and he touches on the granite pillars and architraves, which he compares to the monuments of Giza. And yet, Navil does not explore his idea fully. He does not compare the layout of the structure in any great detail, and he limits his comments to a few passing impressions before settling on his ultimate conclusion. He also makes a curious oversight in logic. Throughout most of the article, Navil is fairly consistent in identifying the funerary character of the architecture and decoration. He compares the Osireion repeatedly to royal tombs, and his final interpretation of the monument is based on a funerary character. And yet, when he's interpreting the date, Navil suddenly changes the criteria. He does not compare the Osireion's design to the royal tombs, but rather to a temple complex. This is a strange gap in his thinking. If he recognizes the tomb or funerary character of the monument, why does he compare it with a temple a type of building with entirely different architectural and religious foundations. We'll explore these questions later when we discuss the date of the Osireion and its overall purpose in greater detail. But looking at his published comments, what he actually wrote, we can see that Navil's interpretation is surprisingly brief, and he doesn't explore these ideas or the arguments in any great depth. To be clear, I am not dismissing Navil's interpretation or his argument or his work, but it is a curious feature of his published discussion, and we should bear that in mind when we are assessing the Osireion overall. Anyway, we will come back to this question in a few moments. But that, briefly, was Navil's interpretation and argument. So at the end of his excavation, Navil's team had fully cleared the Osireion. They had removed all of the sand and rubble that had accumulated over the millennia, and Navil published some of his findings and comments in short academic articles. It is unfortunate that Navil never went further with his excavations or published writings. But, to be fair, that wasn't entirely his choice. Apparently, Navil intended to return and continue the documentation. In one of his articles in 1914, he wrote the following comments, quote, "Next year, when we shall have the necessary contrivances for giving a good light, we shall know better what these sculptures or inscriptions represent." And at the very end of his article, he wrote, "These remarks give an idea of the manifold questions that arise from the discovery of the pool or central hall at Abydos. It is all the more desirable that the fund should be in a position next winter to finish this important work, which we warmly recommend to the interest and the generosity of the friends of old Egypt." End quote. So Navil clearly intended to return. Alas, he published these comments in the middle of 1914. A few months later, continental Europe, the Middle East, and many other regions were engulfed in the First World War. That affected Egypt, and it interrupted archaeological work. The societies that normally funded Egyptology or excavation were suddenly diverted by far more pressing concerns. So whatever Navil hoped to achieve in the following seasons, he was unable to do. Unfortunately, this interruption proved permanent. By the time the war ended in 1918 and 1919, Navil was in his mid-70s, and he ultimately died in 1926 at the age of 82, and the Osireion was his final major excavation. So it seems like Navil's work was largely a victim of circumstance. Although he never published a full, detailed account of the Osireion, he did clearly intend to return. Alas, this did not happen, and Navil's comments were ultimately limited to those few journals. This was a great shame, for just as someone had finally cleared the full Osireion monument, they were unable to finish the job. So, by the end of Navil's work, the Osireion stood fully revealed and ready for further study. It was an unfortunate coincidence that this project took place around 1914, and subsequently the outbreak of global war rather changed the priorities of many individuals, societies, and institutions. That, as they say, is life, but it did affect work on the Osireion. Navil had intended to return, but it was not to be. And following the end of his excavation in early 1914, it would be another 10 years before archaeologists could return. Our story now jumps from 1914, past World War I and the difficult post-war period, before reaching 1926. In that year, a young scholar named Henri Frankfurt organized a new expedition to Abydos. Frankfurt was Dutch. He was born in Amsterdam in 1897. So he was only 5 years old when the Osireion was first discovered. He was in his late 20s when he organized this excavation. In other words, he was much younger than Murray and Navil had been when they explored the Osireion. This is important. Frankfurt was part of a new generation of archaeologists who had learned the fundamentals of scientific excavation, record-keeping, and meticulous discussion from an early stage of their education. As a result, Frankfurt approached the Osireion from a far more considered approach than his earlier predecessors. Murray and Naville were excellent for their time, but they were part of that earlier generation who were most interested in art, sculpture, and textual inscriptions to understand ancient Egypt. Frankfurt was part of the new group, who put a greater emphasis on the physical objects, the context in which they were found, and how it all fit together in an archaeological sense. As a result, Frankfurt's work in the Osireion, and his publication of that work, is the most complete record we have for the entire monument. Following Naville's early work, Frankfurt completely re-excavated the Osireion from 1925 to 1926, and he conducted some follow-up studies and excavations in 1927 and 1929. In the course of this work, Frankfurt and his team focused on every little detail in the Osireion complex. They studied its masonry, examining the methods of its construction. They made complete drawings and copies of the decoration, including the areas that Murray had already done 20 years before. They drained groundwater, especially from the canal in the central hall. Frankfurt made a significant effort to find the bottom of that canal. Alas, it didn't work. His team sifted through rubble and sand, looking for small objects and items that might help confirm the date of the monument, and they photographed the Osireion from top to bottom. Those records, the publications, line drawings, and photographs, are all available free online. Links in the episode description. Frankfurt's team found many traces that the Naville expedition had missed. The most notable was evidence of the construction. Within the masonry, between and connecting the blocks, Frankfurt found dovetails. These are stone clamps, which are inserted into sockets cut in the large stones. The dovetails help connect the masonry and keep the blocks together, an extra layer of strength and stability. What is noteworthy about this discovery is the location of the cramps and the inscription carved upon them. One cramp was found near the entrance to the Great Hall. It had fallen out of the masonry during an earlier disturbance, perhaps when somebody was removing a block. But the other cramp, that was still in the wall. Partway up the wall and below one of the larger granite blocks, Frankfurt and his team found a stone cramp still embedded in its original location. The cramp was only visible because one of the adjacent blocks had broken away at the corner, revealing the core of the structure. Frankfurt considered this decisive regarding the construction of the monument. The position the cramp was in could not have been affected except during the first phase of construction, so its presence must have been a marker of the original building phase. On this subject, Frankfurt wrote the following, quote, "The second dovetail was found in position in the third course from the top in the northeast corner of the building, visible merely because the stone had, in antiquity, lost a large flake. This inscribed dovetail is to be seen, therefore, actually in the wall, below the granite roofing blocks which still rest upon it, and the granite architraves are built into this wall. A stronger proof of the unity of the whole building and of its authorship could not be given." End quote. The building cramps were one of Frankfurt's major discoveries. The location of the second one, still embedded in the masonry, could not have been done during repair work. Its position could only have been achieved during the first phase of construction. Okay, so we have some stone joiners that help anchor the blocks together. Why is that significant? Well, on these cramps there are inscriptions. Carved into the stone, there is a cartouche bearing the name of a king. That king is Men-Ma'at-Ra, aka Sety I. So based on the dovetail cramps, Sety I's builders were doing construction work in the core of the monument, including underneath the heavy granite slabs. Logically, they could not have done that if the slabs were already in place. So, in Frankfurt's argument, this was decisive. Sety I must have been the builder. We'll come back to that later when we discuss the monument overall, but that was one of Frankfurt's key discoveries that helped shape his interpretation of the monument. There was more, though. A second discovery by Frankfort's team was a set of tree pits. These were built above the Osireion, and they were only discovered in the rubble overlaying the outer edges. These tree pits were lined with stone blocks, and they seem to have held conifer trees. Tree pits are quite common, especially in Egyptian temple precincts. They seem to provide gardens to show off the wealth and fertility of the gods and the pharaoh. By themselves, the tree pits are interesting, but they were important because they helped Frankfort in his larger understanding of how the Osireion originally appeared. We'll come back to that later, but it's worth mentioning now. Another find, far less glamorous, were shards of pottery and small traces of tiny objects. These had mostly been missed by Naville and Murray during their excavations, but they seem to present a consistent picture. The pottery was universally 19th dynasty or later. There was some traces of Roman and Coptic periods, when the Osireion had been open and accessible, and even used by later generations. They also found small objects like tiny statues, possibly depicting King Sety I. Overall, the object finds were surprisingly meagre. Apparently, the Osireion had been rather cleaned out over the centuries, and whatever objects had lain within the rubble and detritus had been missed by Naville's excavators, or at least not discussed in his few publications. That's another tragedy of Naville's unfinished work. Finally, another significant find was writing. Shards of limestone bearing hieratic text, the kind of cursive or handwritten form of hieroglyphs, turned up within the monument's rubble. These limestone shards, or ostraca, carried texts related to a construction project, and there's a strong chance that they describe the building of the Osireion. I'll come back to these ostraca later in the episode. Suffice to say, Frankfort's team found them within the monument, and his publication provided a full translation. We'll put a pin in that one and come back to it soon. So Frankfort's excavation was far more meticulous than that of Edouard Naville. To be fair, Naville's team had done the hard part of the labour, clearing out the tons of sand, rubble and detritus that had accumulated within the monument. Now that most of that was gone, Frankfort and his team could focus on the smaller aspects and really get to grips with the structure overall. Fortunately, Frankfort was a detail-oriented researcher, and his publication is quite thorough in its description and analysis of the finds. If you are interested in the Osireion at all, I consider the Frankfort publication a must-read. Link in the episode description. Based on all of his work and the finds within the Osireion, Frankfort was fairly confident in his own interpretations. While Murray had been preliminary and Naville had been firm but vague, Frankfort gave a detailed account of his perspective on the monument. First, the date. Regarding the age of the Osireion, Frankfort viewed the evidence as, quote, both copious and consistent in favour of a 19th dynasty monument. Frankfort disagreed strongly with Naville's interpretation that placed the Osireion in the Old Kingdom. And Frankfort's writing on this topic is quite revealing of his personality. In his book, page 23, Frankfort begins his discussion of the date of the Osireion. Quote, a tradition has taken root as to the great antiquity of the central hall, that is, the large room with the granite slabs, and it is therefore necessary to review the arguments put forward in favour of that traditional view. It has to be admitted that no similar building like the Osireion is known from the 19th dynasty. However, it is not correct to quote the so-called Temple of the Sphinx at Giza as a parallel. Even the most superficial perusal of that building will reveal the fact that it has no features in common with the structure at Abydos, except the use of square granite pillars and architraves. Certainly, our central hall of the Osireion possesses an impressive grandeur, but compared with the smaller but far more finely proportioned pillars at Giza, those at Abydos are heavy and inelegant, and in all other architectural points, the lower sanctuary of Khafra's pyramid temple at Giza and our building at Abydos differ completely. End quote. Frankfort's basic point is that the temples at Giza and the Osireion have a superficial similarity in that they both have square pillars and architraves made of granite blocks. But when you look closer at the actual details, there are far fewer similarities than Neville had suggested. For one thing, the stoneworking at Abydos was far larger and more cumbersome than Giza. And second, if you actually compared the ground plan and architecture of the respective monuments, the only feature that they actually share was the square pillars and architraves. All of the other layouts and arrangements were completely different. Frankfurt also raised an important point about similarities and how similarities do not equal origin. He does this by analogy. Frankfurt compares the Temple of Athena at Athens, the Parthenon, with similar monuments constructed by the Romans. The Roman buildings share architectural similarities, sometimes near identical features, with the earlier Greek structures, and if you didn't know the Romans existed, you might think that their monuments were the work of the Greeks. We see this in the modern world as well. For example, many Western societies design their government and administrative buildings along the neoclassical style, inspired by the ancient Greeks and Romans. If you were just looking at them superficially, you might think all of these structures were built by the same original culture, and yet they are vastly separated by time, distance, and history. Heck, if we go back to the Temple of Athena, the Parthenon, there is actually a one-to-one replica of that monument in the state of Tennessee in the United States. That was built in the late 1800s, but if you didn't know that, you might think it was also a product of the ancient Greeks. In short, Frankfurt hammers home the point: similarity does not equal origin, and when you dig into the details, the similarities are far weaker than they may have initially appeared. Those were his arguments on the architecture. He also had some comments on the decoration of the Osireion, or rather, the relative scarcity of the decoration. This was a point that Neville had emphasized, that supposedly the smooth stone of the central hall was a close ringer for the austere simplicity of the Giza monuments. On that subject, Frankfurt argued the following, quote, "It must not be forgotten that the stern simplicity at Abydos is merely a consequence of the unfinished state of the building, and that we possess evidence that not only the walls, but also the architraves and the pillars were intended to be covered with sculpture." End quote. This is probably the weakest of Frankfurt's arguments. While it is true that the Osireion does have decoration in many of its chambers, we can't assume that the entire structure was intended to be decorated. The parts that have been carved by the pharaoh Meneptah were never finished, and beyond a few traces in the entrance corridors and the final chamber, we can only guess at what Sety had intended. In short, it is dangerous to assume that decoration was always planned, and build your argument from that. It may be valid, but it may not, and this is probably the weaker of Frankfurt's arguments. Finally, Frankfurt makes an important point about the Osireion's masonry. Neville had interpreted the monument as Old Kingdom, largely on the basis of those granite blocks. But as Frankfurt emphasizes, the Osireion is not constructed solely of granite. There are several types of stone all around, including sections underneath the granite and predating that stone. So in order to understand the monument's construction and its original phases, you have to look at the entire building, how it all fits together. He says, quote, "Finally, the granite work cannot be separated from the sandstone or limestone, which is so characteristic of the 19th dynasty. This separation has been attempted by other interpreters, the assumption being that Sety I would have added to an older granite kernel of the monument. However, the second dovetail, the stone clamp, sculpted with Sety's cartouche, was found in position in the northeast corner of the building, actually in the wall below the granite roofing blocks, which still rest upon it, and the granite architraves are built into this wall. A stronger proof of the unity of the whole building could not be given. The granite pillars, furthermore, are founded upon an island that is entirely built of red sandstone, others have argued quartzite, which differs neither in the size nor in the characteristics of its blocks from the walls in which the dovetails are found, and actually linked to that wall by a thrust beam of red sandstone of the same nature. Here again, it is impossible to separate the sandstone from the granite work." End quote. You get a sense of the forceful personality of Henri Frankfurt when it comes to argument and interpretation. But his point is valid. The Osireion is not constructed from a set of discrete, isolated segments, like a child building their first Lego set. The central hall, in particular, is built from a variety of stone, but those stones are interconnected. Different blocks rest upon one another, and different sections of the monument are interlocked, constructed as a cohesive whole. In short, the actual physical properties of the building support the idea of a single, unified building project. And based on the stone cramps embedded within the masonry, Frankfurt argued that the Osireion was most likely a construction project entirely done by Sety I. At last, Frankfurt turned to the objects that were found during the excavations. He said, quote, "Lastly, the objects found in and around the Osireion are either 19th dynasty or later. 19th dynasty pottery was especially common, and a few fragments of black granite statues of Sety I deserve notice. But not a stone or sherd of an earlier period was found." End quote. From his team's exploration, Frankfurt apparently found no evidence that predated the 19th dynasty. To be fair, we do not know the full extent of what objects Naville's excavation might have recovered. He never published the notes in full detail, and he never commented on the objects in any particular focus, so we can't say definitively that such items did not exist. At the same time, we can't argue from what might have been there, only what was. And logically, if Naville had found pottery of the 4th dynasty or artifacts from those earlier periods, he surely would have mentioned them to strengthen his argument for an Old Kingdom date. The fact he did not suggests he did not find them. Again, it is possible he did not find them. But to consider this rationally, we can only argue on what actually was found and discussed in published material. So with no evidence to the contrary, we have to accept Frankfurt's proposition that all of the pottery and artifacts found during the excavations dated to the 19th dynasty or later. You can review his finds for yourself if you wish in Frankfurt's publication, both the description of the artifacts in the first volume and photos of the objects in the second. Again, I highly recommend his book. Link in the episode description. Frankfurt's excavations were, for him, convincing that the monument dated to the 19th dynasty. Again, I'll come back to this later. But that was Frankfurt's argument. Frankfurt's team was the last major excavation project. After they completed their work in the 1920s, the Osireion returned to silence. So Frankfurt downed his tools at the end of the 1920s, and he published his findings in full, meticulous volume in 1933. Surprisingly, that was the last fully funded scientific excavation. In the nearly 100 years since, the Osireion has largely been quiet. Now and again, small-scale excavations and surveys do take place. An Egyptian scholar named Abdel Salam Mohammed Hussein led some minor work in 1950, and from 1986 to 2012, an independent researcher named James Westerman has collaborated with the Ministry of Antiquities on periodic surveys, studies, and small-scale excavations in the Seti Temple and Osireion. Westerman has not yet published his work in any extensive discussion, but he does have quite a detailed website with a full-scale database of notes, photos, and publications that relate to the Osireion generally. If you are interested in the most recent research on the structure, that website is a good resource. Again, there's a link in the episode description. Because he has not reached the end of his work, nor published his findings in a large, comprehensive, and scientific discussion, I can't comment further on James Westerman's efforts. Based on his website, he seems genuinely dedicated and passionate about the project, and I'm sure when he does publish something in full, it will be an interesting read. For now, we'll leave a pin in that and come back in the future when more information is available, and if anything changes, I will add it to this episode. Beyond this, the excavations of the Osireion have been remarkably limited. There was a brief survey in 1992 led by Dr. Stephen Snape from Liverpool University, and smaller survey projects have taken place in the vicinity of the Osireion, the Sety Temple, and the general Abydos area over the past few decades. But again, there hasn't been a full-scale, fully funded excavation project in the Osireion or Sety Temple for nearly 100 years. That's a damn shame. Both of these monuments have a lot more to tell us, and they are desperately in need of conservation, restoration, and greater scientific exploration. Unfortunately, the budgets of academia and archaeology have been shrinking continuously over the past 100 years. Despite what some among the public may think, archaeologists do not live in ivory towers drinking the finest brandy. Most of the time they are begging for any scrap of funding which they can obtain from museums, universities, or private donors. Some of the projects, like Snape's in 1992, seem to have hoped to carry on further and do more extensive work, but for one reason or another, these projects have not progressed beyond initial surveys and excavations. Part of the problem may be that the Osireion has already been excavated. When it comes to raising funding, especially from institutions and private donors, there is a certain marketing factor that goes into the equation. It is easier to fund a project that is exploring a new region or an area that is very likely to produce remarkable discoveries than it is to fund the re-excavation of an old monument. This is a problem that affects many sites throughout Egypt, not just the Osireion. But in this context, that re-excavation factor is particularly strong. The Osireion has already undergone 3 large-scale clearances and studies during the early 1900s. Today, it might be quite difficult to convince the money people to fund yet another exploration. This is mostly speculation on my part, but in the long course of my research on the Osireion, it's fairly clear that the public interest is there, and there are many academics and archaeologists who would love to do a full-scale survey and exploration. But first, we need to get the money. Realistically, the most likely proposition is that the Egyptian government may fund new work if they are able to develop the tourist infrastructure of Abydos. Abydos is still a relatively small town within the wider context of the country, and the actual tourist facilities are severely limited. Most tourists come to Abydos on a day trip, usually from Luxor in the south, or by cruise ships stopping off. And since Egypt's economy is so heavily geared towards and dependent on tourism, Abydos's out-of-the-way situation has probably lowered its overall ranking on the investment and tourism list. So without greater foreign investment, the most likely scenario for the Osireion is that the Egyptian government takes a stronger interest in Abydos and the development of local tourism. In that situation, we are more likely to see the allocation of funding and expertise to fully explore the Osireion. I hope that does happen. The monument deserves it. Maybe one day we can get together a Kickstarter, but as you can imagine, it would be a massive undertaking. Putting all this together, we have the makings of a story. 3 major excavations in 1902, 1912, and 1925 have laid the groundwork for our understanding of the Osireion. Since then, the monument has been mostly quiet on the archaeological front. There are smaller studies now and again, but in terms of a large, fully funded excavation, the Osireion has not enjoyed that luxury for nearly 100 years. That is a shame, and it means that we have not yet reached the end of the monument's story. For now, all we can do is use the information that is available, and, hopefully, future research will add more. After the break, we bring it all together. In the final chapter, we'll explore the Osireion overall. We'll consider the architecture, decoration, and the objects found within to try and arrive at a preliminary conclusion on its significance, its purpose, and, yes, its date. There is still more evidence to examine, still more artifacts to discuss. After the break, we will explore them. See you in a moment. Chapter 3. The Osireion is a fascinating monument. It is possibly unique, although not necessarily, as we'll see. In some respects, the architecture resembles that of temples from the 4th dynasty at Giza, and yet on closer examination, many of the details are different. The building's layout, design, and decoration bear far more similarity with the royal tombs of the New Kingdom, but those tombs were almost universally dug into the cliffs on the western bank of Thebes, and they were separated by several miles from their associated memorial temples. But the Osireion is not dug within a cliff. It is dug straight down into the bedrock, and the memorial temple associated with it, the Temple of Sety I, is right next to the monument. So, no doubt about it, this structure is unusual, highly novel, and possibly unique. To understand the Osireion fully, we have to go bit by bit. Let's start with the big question. How old is the monument? Regarding the Osireion's date, the genesis of its construction, there are two dominant hypotheses. The first one was proposed by Edouard Naville, who, based on architectural similarities, considered the Osireion to resemble the temples at Giza built during the 4th dynasty. The counter-argument presented by Henri Frankfort is that those similarities are really skin-deep. The use of large granite blocks is noteworthy, but there are several different types of stone within the structure, and the interlocking form and construction of the masonry suggests that it was built as a single, cohesive monument. Add to that the discovery of stone clamps embedded within the walls and bearing the cartouche of Sety I, Frankfort concluded that on all archaeological evidence, the monument was most likely 19th dynasty at the earliest. We have gone through both of those arguments in greater detail earlier. Personally, I suspect that Frankfort is correct. At the very least, Frankfort's argument was presented in far greater detail and with far greater reference to the archaeological material actually excavated in the monument. Naville's analysis, when you actually read it, is surprisingly brief and superficial. It is based almost entirely on the presence of those large granite blocks and their apparent similarity to the temples of Giza. But even Naville acknowledged that the physical properties of the granite, the dimensions of the blocks themselves, were radically different between Abydos and Giza. So while they were using the same stone and a similar form, the actual construction was, he acknowledged, quite different. Naville's argument also had a gap in its internal logic. We saw how, throughout his analysis, he understood the funerary character of the monument, and how similar it was, in many respects, to royal tombs of the New Kingdom, and yet, when it came to those granite blocks, Naville abandoned the tomb interpretation and compared the Osireion to an earlier temple. None of that is to dismiss or disrespect Naville's excellent work in clearing the Osireion and studying it as a monument. But if we are considering this question from a purely rational perspective, we must acknowledge that Naville's comments were remarkably brief, surprisingly superficial, and did feature a logic gap in the reasoning. By comparison, Henri Frankfort's analysis was far more extensive, far more detailed in its discussion and reasoning, and based on close examination of many pieces of evidence, all of which were discovered in the Osireion itself. Frankfort reached his conclusion based on analysis of the architecture overall, consideration of the masonry and how the different types of stone fit together, and discussion of the objects found within the monument. This included the pottery, which all came from the 19th dynasty or later periods, smaller items like statue fragments in a 19th dynasty style, and, most importantly, the stone dovetails or cramps, which were found within the monument, in one case still embedded within the masonry itself. Those dovetails, bearing the cartouche of Sety I, could only have been installed during the initial construction phase. Putting all of that together, Frankfort considered the evidence overwhelmingly in favor of a single building project from the early 19th dynasty. Looking at the two arguments side by side, it's really not much of a contest. Naville's interpretation was largely based on a feeling and his perception of similarities with older monuments. By comparison, Frankfort presented a great deal of evidence actually recovered from the Osireion itself. Viewed from a coolly dispassionate perspective, Frankfort's argument is stronger in terms of evidence and internal logic. But let's step away from the personalities. Let's forget Naville and Frankfurt just for a moment, and consider the Osireion from other angles. What other evidence is there to suggest the date of the monument? What would we expect if it was Old Kingdom or 19th Dynasty? How can we consider it all together? First, the older interpretation. If the Osireion was an Old Kingdom structure, one that Seti had found and restored, how could we prove that? What kind of evidence would we expect? Surprisingly, we do have an answer for that. You see, Seti I was quite fond of restoring older monuments, and he tended to leave a signature. During his reign, Seti I's artisans made changes and restorations to many older monuments. These appear throughout Egypt: temples, tombs, even stelae erected by earlier pharaohs. Seti I's restorations are not always obvious, but if you look at the hieroglyphs, he tended to leave a signature. Whenever Seti restored a monument or added to a pre-existing scene, he tended to sign it with a certain phrase. Most of Seti's restorations include a hieroglyph caption, which Egyptologists call the Samawi Menu caption. Samawi Menu roughly translates as making new the monument or restoring the monument, and it is a common phrase in the late 18th and early 19th dynasties when pharaohs were repairing damaged monuments or adding to earlier inscriptions. For example, a stela at Luxor Temple bears the hieroglyphs Samawi Menu ir en Nesubiti men ma'atra. This translates as making a renewal of the monument by the king of southern and northern Egypt, Men Ma'at-Ra, or Seti I. In other words, when Seti did restore monuments throughout Egypt, he tended to sign them with these texts. You will find Seti's Samawi Menu formulae at places like Giza, Memphis, Abu Sir, the Speos Artemidos of Hatshepsut, Karnak Temple, Luxor Temple, the memorial temples on the west bank of Thebes, the island of Elephantine, and several places in Nubia. There is a full catalogue of these restorations in Peter Brand's book, The Monuments of Seti I, pages 45 to 118. Remarkably, there is no such text within the Osireion. We know that Seti I's artists were at work in the Osireion because they completely decorated that chamber at the northern end. Logically, if Seti had found the Osireion, a pre-existing monument, he would have added this kind of inscription somewhere in the structure. Seti was very fond of his restoration texts, and the consistency with which his artists placed the Samawi Menu formula suggests that had he found the Osireion, he would have done something similar. We can't say that with 100% certainty, but the absence of a restoration text is a point in favor of the 19th dynasty argument, given what we know about Seti's habits with regards to restoration and repairs of older monuments. The lack of a restoration text is hard to square with an Old Kingdom Osireion. So we are missing one kind of text which we would expect if the monument was older. But that's an argument from absence. Do we have anything that indicates construction happening at the Osireion during the time of Seti I? Well, again, yes we do. Frankfurt's excavations in the Osireion recovered several ostraca. These were pieces of limestone and pottery which had writing on them. Ostraca are the most common form of note-taking in ancient Egypt. Paper was expensive, so random shards of pottery or stone were the easiest way to make notes and records about daily business. There are a few ostraca recovered from the Osireion, but the most interesting ones seem to describe a construction project happening within this region. For example, one ostraca gives the following account. Quote, "Year unknown, the 4th month of Peret, day 22. The amount of work done by the team of the left-hand side. What the team has dragged from the key of the temple of Men Ma'at-Ra, Seti I, to the south side of the building called Effective is Men Ma'at-Ra, for the god Osiris. The team dragged stones from the quarry. Stones of various shapes and sizes, numbered 29. Blocks for column bases, numbered 3. Paving stones, numbered 2. The total stones dragged from the quarry were 34. Another ostraca said something similar, related more to ships. It said, quote, "Year, unknown. 2nd or 4th month of Peret, day 13. The unloading of this day, done by the team of the left-hand side. What they did in unloading, from the ships that were under the authority of Amun Wasu, 6 shiploads, making 14 stones. From the ship that was under the control of Pen Amun, 7 shiploads, making 15 stones, along with 150 small stones, or possibly bricks. The total of this day was 13 ships, making 29 stones and 150 small stones or bricks. What was also dragged on this day? Quarried stones, numbering 20, and hard stones of various size and shape, numbering 4. End quote. Those may sound a little dry, but they are significant for 2 reasons. Firstly, the ostraca provide exactly the sort of information we would expect regarding the construction of the Osireion. The people unloading the ships are dragging stones of various sizes and shapes for various purposes, and the quantities of the stones are noteworthy. In the second record, for instance, we hear about 6 ships carrying 14 stones, and another 7 ships carrying 15 stones. The low number of stones, just over 2 per ship, suggests that they were very large and very heavy, otherwise you could carry many more. And the ostraca also mention stones from the quarries, including hard stones. That could very easily be a reference to quartzite or granite. Obviously we can't say that with certainty, but these descriptions of construction work are consistent with what we would expect from the building of the Osireion. The ostraca themselves were excavated in the Osireion complex, but apart from their physical location, is there any other indicator that they belong to this monument? Again, yes, maybe. The first ostraca makes specific reference to the Hot, or temple, of Men Ma'at Ra. That is the name of Seti I's Great Temple, just next to the Osireion. The name Hot Men Ma'at Ra, or Temple of Seti I, appears throughout that structure. Notably, the construction team drags their stones from the quay or harbour of that temple to the south side of another building. This building they call Ak Men Ma'at Ra en Usir. That translates as effective is Men Ma'at Ra for the god Osiris. That name does not appear anywhere else on a monument of Seti I, so it's not the name of any other structure that we know about. On that basis, this is most likely the name for the Osireion itself. Of course, that is not definitive proof. The ostraca could have found their way into the monument in later years, part of the rough and tumble of detritus and rubbish. But Occam's razor, the simplest explanation, is that these ostraca are a leftover of the construction process, and that their reference to Ak Men Ma'at Ra en Usir is the 19th dynasty name for the Osireion. You may be wondering, okay, but why would construction ostraca be left in such an important monument? That is a good and important question, and it ties into the next point. At a glance, the Osireion may look like a finished monument, but in truth, it is incomplete. The Osireion has at least 2 phases of decoration during the Pharaonic period. The first phase was done under Seti I, when his artisans carved the northern chamber, and possibly drafted some of the entrance passages and antechambers as well. Subsequently, sculptors working for King Merneptah re-entered the Osireion and started to complete Seti's earlier work, as well as adding their own stuff. Unfortunately, both phases of the decoration were incomplete at the end of the respective reigns. This also applies to the stonework. The outer walls of the Osireion, past the granite pillars and architraves, and those small square chambers or cells, the stone blocks in those areas tend to be rough and unsmoothed, as if the stonemasons have installed them but not got around to finishing them off. So both the masonry and decoration of the Osireion suggest that this monument is unfinished. With that in mind, we can imagine a scenario where the ancient builders or the decorators eventually left the monument, They may have put down their tools, or perhaps their ostraca on which they were keeping notes, intending to return later, but never getting round to it. Alternatively, items like these ostraca may have been discarded in the rubbish heaps around the monument when the workers finally left, but over the years, as the roof was removed and the sand collapsed in, items lying on the surface and related to the construction may have tumbled down into the monument. Both of those are speculative, but you get the point. We can say definitively that artisans and builders were working on the Osireion during the days of Sety I and Merneptah, and it's entirely likely that builders and decorators were keeping written notes of their work as they progressed, and these receipts may have been dumped or discarded when the work suddenly halted. Again, we can't say that with 100% certainty, but since we do not have any other reference to Ak men Ma'adra en Usir, but we do from the Osireion, Occam's razor favours that interpretation. If that is accurate, then these ostraca seem to describe the construction of the monument, and they include descriptions of various stones of different shapes and sizes, coming on enormous ships in surprisingly small loads. Again, that seems to match with what we know of the masonry for this monument. Finally, I will say a brief note about the architecture. In his interpretation, Edouard Naville made a big deal about the supposed similarity between the Osireion's masonry and that of the Old Kingdom temples discovered at Giza. Now, superficially, the large granite pillars and the architraves do bear a passing resemblance to those monuments. However, what Naville ignored, and what Frankfurt pointed out, is that the similarity only exists in the granite blocks. If you look at the rest of the architecture, the Osireion and the Giza temples are radically different in design. You can find drawings and schematics of these temples and the Osireion on Wikipedia. I have also combined these images in the PDF booklet for this episode, which is available on Patreon. Looking at the Giza temples and the Osireion side by side, you can see how different the layout really is. All of the monuments have those square or rectangular pillars made of granite with architraves above. And broadly speaking, those pillars are presented in the same layout. But the similarities end there. The Sphinx temple of King Khafra has quite different shapes for the granite columns, and the arrangements of its rooms around those columns is totally different from the Osireion. Likewise, the Valley temple of King Khafra has a completely different design, more of a T shape compared to the Osireion's rectangle. And both of those temples have different rooms surrounding the central hall, all of which have different layouts and designs to those in the Osireion. Granted, we don't expect every temple to look identical, but if you look beyond the granite blocks and consider the monuments in total, you can see that they all have radically different layouts. With that in mind, the entire comparison between the Osireion and the 4th Dynasty monuments kind of collapses under its own weight, which is ironic. You'd think the granite blocks could hold it up. But seriously, the presence of the large granite pillars and architraves is noteworthy, and it could definitely be an archaic throwback on the part of the 19th dynasty builders. But when it actually comes to the details of architecture and design, the Osireion does not resemble those 4th dynasty temples beyond a superficial level. That doesn't say it's not Old Kingdom, but it's a point to consider. By comparison, the Osireion bears a much stronger similarity to the royal tombs of the 18th and early 19th dynasties. Again, you can find ground plans for these online, especially at the website Theban Mapping Project. I've put some of them in the PDF booklet to compare the Osireion with 18th dynasty sepulchres. Long story short, the central hall of the Osireion and the entrance passages and antechambers are remarkably similar to the monuments of the mid-18th dynasty. Tombs like Amenhotep II and Thutmose IV are nearly identical in their layout to what we see in the Osireion. The burial chambers of 18th dynasty tombs also have square pillars and architraves, as well as staircases that form sort of podiums, and separate areas with slots in the ground for the royal sarcophagi. Of course, there are some differences in the minor details, and every royal tomb has its own unique features and idiosyncrasies, but viewed as a whole, the Osireion is remarkably similar to those royal sepulchres, certainly much closer to those than the 4th Dynasty temples. Likewise, certain features in the central hall of the Osireion are remarkably similar to the burial chambers of the 19th Dynasty and later. Comparing these tombs with the Osireion, I have noticed that, starting in the reign of Sety I, the royal builders suddenly adopt a new style for the burial chamber. They start to include a curved ceiling with a large series of murals or tableaux adorning the respective walls. It's hard to describe in words and it's easier to see in pictures, but the basic idea is that, starting with the reign of Sety I, the royal burial chambers take on a nearly identical shape to the one we see in the Osireion. To be fair, you could argue that the Osireion was already there and Sety I took inspiration from it. But if you are following that logic, you would need to compare the Osireion with burial chambers of the 4th Dynasty or the Old Kingdom generally, and notably, they do not follow this architectural pattern or design. So if you are comparing funerary monuments, then no matter how you slice it, the Osireion's architecture and decorative elements are much closer to the New Kingdom tombs than they are to anything from earlier periods. Again, you can find images of all these monuments, along with ground plans and schematics, on Wikipedia or at Theban Mapping Project for the New Kingdom tombs and Digital Giza for the Old Kingdom. I have also put extensive pictures and comments in the PDF booklet available on Patreon, and when I do my YouTube lecture in the future, I'll make sure to highlight all of these elements. Anyway, you get the point. Edouard Naville drew a superficial comparison between the Osireion and the Giza temples, but if you start to look at the details, the Osireion is much closer to a New Kingdom monument than it is to anything else. So if you put aside any preconceptions and look at the monuments themselves, we reach an inevitable conclusion. Based on the physical properties of the structures and comparisons with anything else that might match them, the Osireion has all the hallmarks of a New Kingdom structure. So, at the risk of exhausting the point, let's quickly wrap that all up together. When you look at the Osireion as a whole, considering its architecture, decoration, the objects found within, and its comparison with other monuments, everything together seems to point to a New Kingdom genesis. The design of the monument is incredibly similar to royal tombs of the 18th and 19th dynasties. The masonry has some unusual features, like the large granite slabs, but it also has a whole suite of limestone, sandstone, and quartzite blocks, which are all consistent with 19th dynasty building practices. And those blocks are not separate or isolated features. They are interlinked sections of a cohesive building plan. Many of the blocks, including the granite slabs, are resting on different types of stone, suggesting a single building phase, all taking place at once. There is even physical evidence for Sety I embedded within the masonry, in the form of those dovetail cramps, some of which are still in situ. The Osireion's decoration is also 19th dynasty. The wall carvings are unfinished, but they all date to Sety I or Merneptah, and the objects include ostraca recording construction, and possibly giving the name of the monument as Sety I is effective for Osiris. The pottery dates exclusively from the 19th dynasty and later periods. Granted, we are not sure what Naville may have missed during his excavations, but we can't argue on what may have been there, and Naville probably would have mentioned anything which matched his Old Kingdom hypothesis. Finally, if Sety I had discovered the Osireion and repaired or restored it, we would expect a certain type of text. On many monuments throughout Egypt, this king included captions specifically naming his work as a Samawi menu, or renewing of the monument, for whichever ancestor or predecessor he was invoking. There is nothing like that in the Osireion, which we would expect if Sety had restored the monument rather than commissioned it. Individually, each of those points may not sound very convincing, but if you put them together, that's a hefty balance sheet in favor of the 19th dynasty. By comparison, the Old Kingdom argument largely boils down to large granite blocks are similar, though not identical, to ones found at Giza. Of course, you may weigh the evidence differently, and I'm under no illusion that these arguments will convince people who are truly dedicated to the Old Kingdom or earlier hypothesis. But after going through every scrap of archaeological discussion and scientific data, references in the bibliography, I think the evidence is consistent for a 19th dynasty date. That being said, this is not the last word on the Osireion. Despite undergoing 3 major excavations during the early 1900s, the Osireion has remained quiet ever since. As a result, the Osireion is in dire need of good scientific care and attention, and a hefty dose of conservation. Because the monument is exposed to the sky, sand and debris continue to fall down into the Great Pit, and the presence of groundwater provides 2 complications. It encourages the growth of plants that might overtake and damage the masonry, and the groundwater itself could always be a threat to the stability of the foundations. So the Osireion desperately needs some TLC. And from the historical perspective, there are plenty of questions yet to answer. For one thing, the whole groundwater factor in the canal of the central hall, that is an intriguing feature, and the source of that water remains unidentified. Does the canal which surrounds the central island of the hall go deeper than it seems? Quite possibly. Is there a tunnel or channel underneath the Osireion that connects to a local aquifer or water source nearby? Maybe. Are there additional artifacts, or even chambers, to discover in the monument or its immediate vicinity? That is speculative, but it's possible. The past decade has been big on scanners and survey technology, identifying hidden chambers or cavities in monuments. Out of all the 19th dynasty structures, the Osireion is an excellent candidate for that kind of study. So there are plenty of questions and hypotheses for scholars to investigate on a careful scientific basis, and we really can't say the Osireion's tale is finished. For now, the best anyone can say is further research is needed. That is a bit unsatisfying, but hey, that's ancient history. Chapter 4. Now, we have explored the Osireion overall as a monument. We have discussed the excavation history and the various interpretations. We have considered the architecture, the decoration, the objects, possible records of its construction, and even, maybe, its name. Now, at long last, we can address that final nagging question. What is the Osireion's purpose? Why build this strange tomb-like structure behind the Seti temple? I have touched on this here and there already, but let's bring it together. On the evidence currently available, the Osireion is most likely a tomb. A symbolic tomb, or cenotaph, but a tomb nonetheless. The monument's architecture, similar to an 18th or 19th dynasty tomb, and its decoration, including the Book of the Dead and the Book of the Gates, are all consistent with the funerary practices of the New Kingdom royal tombs. So looking at the design and decoration, the Osireion is most likely following those principles. This was recognized by the 3 excavators, Margaret Murray, Edouard Naville, and Henri Frankfurt. All interpreted the monument as a symbolic tomb of some kind. The big question is, who is the tomb for? The most likely answer is that this monument is a tomb for Osiris. Like any deity, Osiris needed a place to rest, to recharge his energies, and to lie protected within a safe space. Now, because Osiris was a dead god, or at least dead and resurrected, many of the features of his resting places take the form of tombs. Osiris tombs are an interesting phenomenon in Egyptian religion, and we could do a whole episode just about those. Long story short, the ancient Egyptians, or at least those faithful to Osiris, recognized that the god needed a place to lie in state. He needed his own tomb, a place where he could be worshipped and protected from danger. Before Seti I, Osiris did have a tomb at Abydos. Just west of Seti's great temple and the Osireion, you will find an ancient cemetery called el-Kab. el-Kab is the modern name for a necropolis dated to the 1st and 2nd dynasties. The el-Kab is significant as the burial place of some of Egypt's earliest rulers. And across the centuries, Egyptians of many generations made pilgrimages to this necropolis to honor the royal ancestors, the ancient Horus kings. One of those tombs, the tomb of Jer from the First Dynasty, slowly attained the reputation of being the tomb of Osiris itself. That is not an exaggeration. When archaeologists excavated the tomb of Jer, they found a monument dedicated to the worship of this god. Within the tomb of Jer lay a stone Osiris bed. This is a stone structure shaped like a funerary couch, the sort that we found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. On that couch lies a figure of Osiris. He is deceased, wrapped in a shroud and undergoing mummification, but he wears his crown, indicating his royal power. Around his body, a series of birds represent deities who protect Osiris, and on top, another bird, a kite, rests upon Osiris's groin. This bird is the goddess Isis, who, in legend, alighted upon the body of Osiris to conceive their son Horus. This stone bed, recovered from the tomb of Jer, presents that idea in stone, a literal physical representation of the story. Now, that stone bed from Jer's tomb dates to the Middle Kingdom, but we know the idea was still popular during the time of Sety I. Within Seti's great temple at Abydos, you will find images just like this bed carved on the walls of chapels. And that leads me to suspect that Sety originally planned for the Osireion to have another of these stone beds. That rectangular slot at the heart of the central hall is just the right dimensions for this kind of object, and I would not be surprised if Sety intended to put one of these relics in that location. That is speculative on my part, even if it's based on artifacts and art. But personally, I suspect that Sety was trying to construct a new tomb for Osiris, a new monument in suitably magnificent grandeur that could honor the deity and provide a new center for his religion. I don't think the Osireion was intended to be a temple, a place for regular visitation or religious rituals. That is possible, and maybe if the Osireion had been finished, that might have been one of its functions. But when archaeologists uncovered the entrance to the Osireion, they found that it had been bricked up with mud bricks stamped with the name of Sety I. At the very least, when the king died, the monument was sealed, and that suggests it was not intended to be reopened. Again, that's quite similar to an actual tomb. So I suspect that the Osireion was intended to be buried, not accessed by priests and not used for regular rituals. Its mere presence and the preservation of its contents would be a source of magic and a suitable offering to the great god's majesty. But I don't think the Osireion is a temple necessarily. I think it is a tomb, intended to be closed and secluded. Above ground, the great temple of Sety would provide all the functions of your normal memorial sanctuary. The priests would make offerings, they would conduct prayers and rituals, and that would help complement the Osireion to ensure that the great deity Osiris, king of the dead, and, in the afterlife, the incarnation of Sety himself, those beings would enjoy their eternal worship. A couple of obvious questions that arise from that possibility. Why would Sety I build a new tomb for Osiris? If the tomb of King Jer over at the el-Kab was still functional, why go to all this effort? That one we can only speculate, but a plausible scenario was security. We know that the cemetery at el-Kab was quite exposed over in the western reaches of Abydos, and despite its sacred reputation, the site had been damaged before, during more chaotic phases of Egyptian history, like the First Intermediate Period. We have evidence for rival political powers or armies damaging Abydos and plundering some of the royal tombs. Those events had happened 700 years before Sety I, but there had been other times of chaos closer to his own day. The Second Intermediate Period, in which Egypt was divided between multiple polities, was only 250 years in the past, and during that time there had even been a local dynasty in the region of Abydos, a dynasty that may have ended in destruction, Finally, the late 18th dynasty, the end of King Ai and the ascent of King Horemheb, might have witnessed its own small-scale civil war. That is entirely speculative, but you get the point. Phases of instability, even chaos, were not a distant memory. They had occurred before, and they might happen again. It's not hard to imagine that Seti, a new king for a new dynasty, may have been particularly concerned with the religion and security of Osiris. Another explanation could be political. We have already seen that in his great temple, Seti I put a lot of emphasis on the royal ancestors. He included an entire list of the ancient monarchs, going back, supposedly, to the very start of the kingdom. Seti appears to have a great interest in those royal predecessors. This may have been part of his political program, a way to guarantee his own legitimacy and that of his family, a family that had come from nothing to take the throne of Egypt. So perhaps Seti invested huge resources in the worship of Osiris because that was a meaningful way to demonstrate his legitimacy as a pharaoh and guarantee his control, and that of his family, over the royal authority. I'll come back to this point next episode, the fourth part of our tour, because there are additional parts of Seti's temple and nearby monuments where this becomes even clearer. Finally, the simplest explanation could be piety. Perhaps Seti invested huge resources in the construction of his temple and the Osireion simply because he could. Seti may have had a personal or spiritual affinity for Osiris, or he may have felt that honoring this god properly and lavishly was a good way to guarantee his own immortality and to associate his memory and legacy with that of the King of the Dead. Whether that was motivated by altruism, deep faith, or cynical goals, Seti I may have believed that by associating himself with Osiris, providing a new temple and tomb for the god, he could connect his legacy with that of the ancient deity. In other words, Seti may have built the Osireion and the temple simply because he wanted to. He wanted the recognition that came from such piety, and he wanted to be associated with the King of the Dead. We should not ignore that possibility. Although modern historiography likes to emphasize systems, trends, and the social or political forces that push communities in particular directions, when you have an absolute monarchy, like the ancient Egyptian kingship, there is always space for the personal and spiritual will. Again, I'll come back to this next episode when we discuss Seti's great temple and project overall. But long story short, security, politics, and piety could easily have motivated Seti to invest in this enormous project. Whatever Seti's specific motivations, it does seem like in subsequent generations he achieved some of that connection and association with the god Osiris. During the 1920s, the excavations by Henri Frankfurt and his team recovered several ostraca, pieces of limestone and pottery with writing on them, written at different periods but recovered from the rubble of the Osireion. One of those texts, written a few hundred years after Seti, was quite revealing. In Dynasty 22, in the first millennium BCE, a scribe named Pedewa visited the Osireion, and he left a record of his pilgrimage. Pedewa wrote the following, quote, "Made by the scribe Pedewa and his companion, the scribe Ped-Amun, of the Temple of Osiris, who came to see the hidden place of the underworld, of the king Men-Ma'at-Ra, life, prosperity, health." End quote. That is an interesting record. Pedewa mentions the Ta Shetai en Duat en Men-Ma'at-Ra, Ankhweja Seneb, which literally translates as the hidden place of the underworld of King Seti. Alternatively, you could translate it as the burial chamber or underground crypt of that king. In other words, it appears that Pedewa and Ped-Amun visited the Osireion, and they considered it to be a monument of Seti I, one that connected him with the afterlife and was a sacred tomb. So whatever his original motivations, Seti did achieve a certain legacy associated with Osiris. In the first millennium BCE, 2 scribes came to visit the Osiris temple, and while there, they made sure to visit the subterranean complex of Seti's Osireion. Apparently, Men Ma'at Ra continued to enjoy an association with the great deity of Abydos for centuries after his death. Based on that interpretation, a symbolic tomb and a memorial temple next door, here is a possible scenario for how the monument was conceived and intended. This is just my personal speculation based on what I have learned so far. Around 1303 BCE, give or take, King Seti I may have visited the region of Abydos. He might have made a pilgrimage to the cemetery at el-Kab, the tombs of the earliest rulers, and, supposedly, the burial of Osiris himself in the tomb of King Jer. Subsequently, Seti may have decided to build his own false tomb or cenotaph with an accompanying memorial temple. The Osireion project may have started life as an underworld or Amduat tomb, similar to those of earlier periods, but with more recent architecture and decorative motifs. The builders placed the Osireion close to the Seti temple, both to protect it as part of the temple precinct, and maybe to facilitate the penetration of groundwater that would surround the central island on which Osiris was buried. Construction of the Osireion would have started early, before the temple itself. Some of the underground rooms would need to be excavated and reinforced before the western parts of the temple could be constructed. The funerary chamber at the northern end of the Osireion is most likely the first section that was built. It was also the first section to be decorated, with scenes of the underworld, the sky, astronomical details, and even calendars and clocks included by Seti's workforce. Construction would have progressed on the Osireion over a number of years. Once the great pit was excavated, the reinforcing walls of limestone and sandstone could go in. The central podium of sandstone or quartzite could be constructed. And then, finally, the great granite blocks could be installed. Ostraca, recovered from the site, may record some of the processes involved in that work. Unfortunately, the Osireion was still unfinished when King Seti died. Most of the architecture seems to have been complete, although some of the blocks were undressed, retaining their rough edges and unsmoothed surfaces. Seti's artisans had begun the decoration, at least in one chamber, and they may have sketched or drafted the decoration in other rooms. Alas, this had to be abandoned once the pharaoh was deceased. The artisans packed up their tools, left the Osireion, and bricked up the door. A couple generations later, another king, Merneptah, sent his representatives back to the structure. They added new carvings, or at least started to finish the work that Seti had begun. It's not entirely clear why they did this, but we will return to that in the future. At the very least, Merneptah's work was consistent with that of Seti, an overriding focus on funerary and underworld elements, suggesting, ultimately, that the Osireion was designed as a symbolic tomb or cenotaph. The occupant of this tomb was most likely Osiris, or at least Seti I as Osiris. Osiris, the king of the dead, ruled over the afterlife, the Duat, and following his own death, Seti I would unite with that god, and together, as a single being, they would rule the immortal fields. The Osireion provided a place for the security of Osiris' body, possibly a stone statue, an Osiris bed, conveying the image of the god in death. The tomb would guarantee the form, and the temple of Seti just above and to the east would provide a place for the worship and sustenance of the souls of these beings. As long as the offerings, prayers, rituals, and celebrations took place within the temple, the image of Osiris, or Seti, residing within the Osireion, could sleep undisturbed, and the magic of this great god could protect the world and its people. There is so much more to say about the Osireion, but for now, that brings us to the end of this episode. Phew, that was a big one. The Osireion might be the most frustrating monument I've discussed in a long time. Don't get me wrong, it's fascinating, and I definitely got addicted to the rabbit hole of research around this monument. But once you dive into the details, the archaeology, and the surviving records, the Osireion is largely a story of modern excavation and interpretation. The actual history of the monument, the contemporary and later records, its decoration, and its overall significance, that is incredibly sparse. The building itself is unfinished, the decoration is incomplete, and many sections of the masonry were never smoothed and polished. That leaves huge gaps in the monument's tale, and those gaps have encouraged a lot of speculation. I have done my best to cover as much material as possible, but there is no end to the hypotheses that surround this particular monument. If I tried to cover every single little topic and idea, we would be here for 9 or 10 hours. I am not Noah Caldwell-Gervais, so I can't do a deep dive of that length, but I've done my best with this podcast episode. And one day, when I do my YouTube lecture, I will cover a lot of this in more visual contexts so that we can really explore the hard physical evidence about the Osireion's date and purpose. For now, it is time to say farewell and leave the Osireion here. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. This episode was a little bit late, and I thank you for your patience. But as you can see, it had an unusually long runtime, and that took extra effort to polish and refine. But for better or worse, this is my take on the Osireion, at least for now. We will return to the monument in future. As I mentioned, King Merneptah, one of Seti's successors, returned to this structure to add decoration and refine some of the work. And one of the Abydos survey projects identified tentative hints of another monument that might be similar to this one. There could be a second Osireion not too far from Seti I. Those are stories for another day. For now, take care, and may the great god Osiris and his partner Isis watch over you and your loved ones. May you have a blessed week.